Hey guys, this is 16B lectures. We're going to look at methods of dealing with solid municipal waste, the life cycle of input and output of different products, and the pros and cons of using things that are seemingly more sustainable consumer products such as paper cups, paper plates, things like that, aluminum, glass. We're going to look at some of the things that you should think about when I'm making decisions as a community, whether or not you should put a lot of efforts into recycling versus incineration versus reuse versus, just not using anything, wiping human beings off the face of the earth, all those things. All right. So landfills are the primary destination for municipal solid waste. We throw away more than about 50% of our things. It's worth noting that in the U.S. over the last 30 years, we've definitely improved on our recycling. And a little more than a third of the things we do actually end up being reused and recycled or composted. Combustion with energy recovery. So this is talking about things like you saw like in Finland and Sweden, where they're actually using generated energy from incinerating their waste, right? And they're actually buying their waste from other countries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about landfills. You need to know this word leachate. It's basically just stuff that seeps out of the landfill. They try to contain all of the liquid waste using clay and plastic liners. That has its own kind of drawbacks as well, especially when you start talking about decomposition and degradation of the solid municipal waste. The leachate is the thing that we're afraid of. Right? This will get into the groundwater, get into the soil, of course, and then it'll eventually get into our drinking water, right? So this is one of the things that we have to kind of weigh as a pro and con of having a landfill. Now, we've gotten a lot better at landfills because back in the day we used to have open dumps all over the place. Now we have this thing called a sanitary landfill. It contaminates the surrounding environment as little as possible, and we take into consideration things that you learned about when you learned about soil and infiltration. Try to have a lot of clay and even use a little bit of plastic. A tipping fee is something that can it is a way that a government can kind of encourage people to reduce the amount of waste, because if you know that you have to pay a fee for a certain tonnage of waste that you're depositing at a landfill, it might make you think twice, right? Typically, the average rate is about $50 per ton. In the Northeast, where there's a little bit less land, so remember that in the Northeast there's a little bit less land, so it's closer to $70 per ton. All right, so this is a diagram of what a landfill looks like, basically. You need to make sure you know the steps, just like when we did water treatment, how you had to know the steps. Same thing here. So you see the clay liner. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. So anything that is not put into recycle is going to go to a landfill. That is, of course, if you don't incinerate it. All right, so put here, you notice here we have a clay liner, maybe even plastic sometimes. All right, the tractor is going to compact things down, and this right here is an issue because if you are compacting this stuff out, you are going to decrease the amount of oxygen available down there. So guess what's going to happen? You're going to decrease any sort of biological processes. So you're not really going to get a good amount of breakdown, right? And there's a video that hopefully you guys are watching tonight and tomorrow morning that shows that 30 to 40 years later, they're digging up some of these landfills and they still find newspaper articles that you can read, right? It's clear as day. Okay, so they're compacting this down. And this is actually a problem as well when you're talking about just any sort of construction site, because it compacts the soil. Tractors compact the soil, so it'll decrease the amount of O2, the secret important ingredient in soil. Okay, so the solid waste gets here. Now, any sort of leachate that could get out, you can get around that problem of it getting into our water by having some sort of collection system, and you can take it to a wastewater treatment plant and do this thing called ternary treatment, right? A lot of places aren't required to have ternary treatment, but ternary treatment, you're chemically treating other things at the end, right? Not just solid waste from human waste and things and biological agents, right? You can actually have a third level of treatment at a water treatment facility plant that can get rid of some of these things, right? Okay. So let's say you do have a lot of trash compaction, so you don't have oxygen, so you're going to get anaerobic respiration, which leads to a lot of CH4. when you break things down. So anything that does get broken down is going to be this methane, which is really, really bad because you end up with these gigantic explosions, right? That's really, it is a danger. Plus, it is a very potent greenhouse gas, right? Okay, so what you can do is you can have a silver lining, a silver trash lining right here. Is if you put some pipes here to extract this methane, have like a methane digester sort of thing, you end up being able to produce some energy out of this, right? If you collect successfully that methane. Pretty neat, right? All right, so let's go ahead and put one in your backyard, right? Wrong. You're not really going to want that. How do we decide where we're going to sit a landfill, right? So we have this idea that you need to know. One of my favorite comedians of all time introduced me to this term, NIMBY, not in my backyard. He used to say, build more prisons, right, to help deal with crime. But then he'd go, but not here, right? It's the exact same thing with landfills. It's good to kind of get rid of our trash, and we don't want to have to worry about like, oh, am I above my limit for throwing away things this week? Am I going to have to worry about somebody coming after me? Do I have some sort of city ordinance that says like if I have this much trash in a trash can, like that's it? And let's just get around that by building more landfills, right? So we can throw away as much as we want to our heart's desire, right? But the problem with that is that it has to go near somebody. Now, one of their students today, one of your classmates, was talking about how they had a family member in Houston. They live not right next to a solid municipal waste facility, but maybe like 5, 6, 7, 8 miles of down the road. Now, of course, those scents, they never leave you. You never forget. They travel down the road, and you smell them. So that's something that you're going to have to consider now. If somebody goes to try to buy your house and they drive through that same roadway, they might be dissuaded from buying your house because it's going to be right in their backyard, and it's not a very pleasant thing. Now, the city went ahead and did something like, I think the students said they put air fresheners, like these gigantic sprayers on poles that would spray, and it would be carried downwind with the trash smell, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so here's NIMBY, talking about it here, a lot of environmental injustice, right, as it messes up the environment right there. Because keep in mind, when you remember that landfill site, that stuff's not going to biodegrade, so it's not going to just be like a rainforest there after it's all said and done, right? You might be able to build a park on there, maybe some shallow root system plants like shrubs, but you don't want to build things like oak trees and really deep rooting plants that can potentially poke through and pierce through the plastic and clay linings of the landfill, because then you end up with leachate again. All right. So here are some of the environmental consequences of landfills. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but leachate is the big one. Leachate is the key, right? It gets into your waterways. So with landfills, remember that your main concern is what happens to the water, right? And that's really, really big contrast to incineration. Okay, and it's just a matter of time. You really can't get around it. You're going to end up with some leaching no matter what. Even after you close it down, something in the future, whether it be tectonic activity or plants growing in there, or just the breakdown of just plastics over time, or maybe some sort of biological process can break through that seal, and it can mess things up. And anaerobic decomposition generates methane that can lead to explosions in greenhouse gas. So these are all cons right here. All right, let's talk about incineration. So you just basically burn things, and one really nice thing about it is you can use that to boil water, and the boiled water creates steam, and this should sound very familiar by this point, right? You turn some sort of turbine, which has a magnet around a coil. You're talking physics now. You're doing electromagnetic induction. You can charge a generator, go to a power grid, all that good stuff, right? So it's just like any other type of power plant, whether it be nuclear or hydroelectric, geothermal, wind energy. At some point, it all comes down to like those same mechanical parts, right? All right, here's some of the things that come out of it that aren't so good. All right, you have ash. You have two types. You have bottom ash and fly ash, and they differ in particle size and density. And obviously, bottom ash is going to collect at the bottom. It's not light enough to aerosolize and fly all over the place. Fly ash is collected from the chimney, exhaust pipe, or a furnace. And remember that there are ways to deal with particulate matter like this. Remember your electrostatic precipitators, your scrubbers, and etc. Right? Okay, when you're creating energy from this waste, it's called, very easy to remember, waste to energy. Let's move move it right along. I'm going to move a little faster here. So here are the steps, and remember, not all these things have to happen in precise order. Keep that in mind. But just know right here, there's a tipping fee. Usually the tipping fee for incineration averages around $70 per ton. So that's something to kind of consider. Your cost to incinerate goes up because guess what? You need energy to burn things, right? It's not the same as a landfill where you just put it down in the ground, right? You can just, you have to use energy to ignite it, right? All right, so you have some trash here. You drop it in the hopper, Yeah, the refuse bunker here. The crane gets it. Bottom ash goes here, and you save the environment, or at least the air quality, a little bit by having a baghouse filter for the fly ash to get caught in. And these can be wet or dry filters, right? And now that you've studied this chapter, when you drive around to different foundries around San Antonio and wherever you're at, whenever you see shapes of containers near little industrial zones, you probably know what these are now. You can recognize that this looks like something where something's being incinerated, and then the feeding tube here is going to go to like some sort of filter, right? And the chimney can be outfitted with like a precipitator or something like that, right? Let's talk about why these things are bad, so the downsides. I mean, the positive thing being that you don't have to put this in the ground anymore. You're saving a lot of real estate, right? You're not having to worry about where this stuff is going. Okay, but let's see what happens here. Okay, so you have to pay a little bit more because of the energy. And the air pollutants in there have incomplete combustion of plastics and metals like lead. All right, the incomplete combustion of plastics and metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, other things like that. So all those things right there, because they used to be inside materials that were burned. Now that they are left over from incomplete combustion, because you can't completely burn anything unless you know. I mean, you'd have to use the temperature that your highest burning point would be to be able to make sure you burn everything. Since you can't do that, you're going to end up with all this stuff left over, and you have a really high concentration of these things, right? So anything that does get out is going to be incredibly hazardous, right? So whereas you had a problem with water contamination with landfills and leachate, you're going to have a lot of problems with air contamination here, right? So as a society, you have to decide, which one do I like better? Do I like drinking water, or do I like breathing air? Right? Which way would I rather die? Right? So that's fun. All right, hazardous waste. So we have to talk about a couple of little regulations and acts that have come up to help us with hazardous waste. Some interesting things here. All right, what is hazardous waste? It's liquid, solid, gaseous, or sludge waste material that is harmful to humans. Collection and handling has to be done by specially trained personnel, and you have to treat it before disposal. And it's worth noting here, that legislation says that if you have a lot of contaminated sites or contamination, it has to be treated. And what they mean by treated is it has to be less detrimental to the environment. So less detrimental, not safe, just less dangerous, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the RCRA, what I call this right here, this kind of reminds me of the RZA, which kind of reminds me of Jet Li, who was in the movie, one of my favorite movies, Cradle to the Grave. He was also in Romeo Must Die, but that wasn't part of this at all. Okay, so remember, RCRA is it reminds me of the Wu-Tang Clan, the RZA, and Jet Li could have been part of the Wu-Tang Clan. And that he was in a movie called Cradle to Grave, which is the other name for Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So the recovery right here, you can think of this as like a tracking, which is what Jet Li does. He tracks people down. So they track these hazardous waste materials, which is really important because we talked about this in class today. And if you don't know the amount of hazardous crap that all these companies are producing or holding on to, you can't figure out if they're doing anything wrong with them, right? If I have 10 tons of nuclear waste, and then tomorrow, and to ask me a really obvious question, if tomorrow I only have 9 tons of it, right? your question's probably, where the heck did it go, right? But if you didn't know how much I had in the first place, you'd be none the wiser if I got rid of half of it in your backyard, right? So it's very important that they track this stuff, and they keep track of these hazardous materials. So that's the RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, also known as cradle to grave tracking. Okay, the CERCLA, CERCLA, is the Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and in CERCLA you need to remember the word compensation, because another word to compensate is to fund something, right? That's how you can remember it, right? It's called the Superfund Act. Okay, that's the common name for it. Okay, they have a federal tax that helps fund abandoned and non-operating hazardous waste sites and authorizes federal government to respond directly. So the government itself can respond directly to help clean up sites or prevent imminent threats on human health or the environment, right? So it does give them some punitive powers, punitive authority as well, so they can punish people that don't do what they're supposed to do. So let's say you don't meet quite the standards to get super funding to clean up a site. Your site can be considered a brownfield, and this is places that are like past gas stations, or maybe factories, and so forth, things like that. So they're not quite bad enough to be like a gigantic public health emergency, but they're bad enough to where the government go, hey, let's work together with your local government, your state government, and we'll kind of work in concert. And there are some kind of downsides to that too, because it is a combination of federal and state. There isn't like a set way to like deal with the contamination. So a lot of the criticism says that, well, they don't really do that much. They really don't do that much. They haven't fixed a lot. Right? And here's one of the main weaknesses of it, is you don't have legal control to be able to punish people that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Okay, so let's look at some other ways to think about life cycle analysis of solid waste. Hey, life cycle analysis, and this is one of the objectives you had in class today. Cradle to grave analysis can kind of really affect the way that you see things, right? Like, so is it ideal to always want to like reduce as much as possible, and if we do have to use stuff, recycle it as much as possible? Sure, that seems to be the most ideal thing. But sometimes trying to recycle can do a lot more harm in a particular area to the environment than if you were to just throw it in the trash and make a new one, right? So an example of that would be, in Texas, we have these glass bottles that we get, or these these aluminum cans, which are relatively easy to recycle and have a really good closed loop recycling capability. But if you look at the return on recycling them, other than just the altruistic motive of saving the earth, there's 5 cents if you turn it into places like Michigan, Maine, Pennsylvania, all that stuff, even California, and we're not anywhere near that. So in order to make good on that and to actually have an economic incentive, we would have to drive it all the way over to one of those places, or at least ship it somehow. And you know that driving uses up a lot of fossil fuels, it creates a lot of emissions, so that's something you have to really consider, so it might not be practical. If you're not close to a landfill, if you don't have the real estate to build landfills, if you don't have the transportation, the infrastructure to transport these materials, these are all things you have to consider, right? So maybe in the end, a styrofoam cup might be more environmentally sound of an idea than making paper cups if you don't have any forest nearby, right? That's something to think about. So integrated waste management is a more holistic approach. So this is basically the idea that a city or a municipality has to decide on the combination of ways that it reduces, manufactures waste, manufactures products, and it combines the idea of reduction, source reduction, and recycling, reuse, and reduction at all places, right? And you see how you dispose, how do you recycle, what percentage of each do you do? This is very, very important, right? And this gets into the idea of upcycling as well. Upcycling is not when you cycle upward. It's when you take waste product and you make it into something that is a higher value, higher monetary value, right? So you're integrating like old discarded plastic bottles maybe into, so PET bottle, maybe they can become bricks or cinder blocks or something like that, which can be used for construction, especially for public works, right? So this is something that had very little value in the beginning, and in the end, creates a public good that we can all use, right? So these are things that we can consider. See if you can come up with some things too that have been repurposed and made into more valuable products than when they were thrown away. All right, that's 16B. Good luck.